Deputy Jonathan O'Brien.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Minister, I warmly welcome the introduction of this bill. You know, personally, I have been calling for this legislation for a number of years, and at the outset, I think it's only appropriate to mention your predecessor, Senator Éireann Ó, who in the last Dáil was really a champion of this legislation and faced some stiff opposition in relation to it. And I don't think, if it wasn't for his doggedness in trying to get this issue moved on, I don't think we would be here today, and I just want to put that on the record, that Éireann should be mentioned. Minister, I will get to the bill in a minute, but I want to touch on some of the falsities that are being put about, and also some of the negative, I suppose, press and commentary around the provision of an injecting centre. First of all, people will ask, is there a need for one? Well, when you consider that we have worldwide 13 million people who inject drugs every single day, 13 million. In this state alone, the latest figures, and granted they are old figures, they are 2014 are the latest set of figures we can work off of. We have nearly 10,000 people who are receiving treatment for opiate use in this state. We had, in 2014, over 16,500 people entering treatment for a drug problem. And of those 16,500 people, 4,500 of them were opiate users, or opiates were their main choice of drugs. There were 943 new cases in 2014. It was interesting what Deputy Chambers has said, that this is not a Dublin issue. The figures bear that out. Of those 4,500, only 2,100 were resident in Dublin. The rest were outside of Dublin. Almost 3,000 of them were men. 5 are only registered as being under 18, but we all know that there are plenty more people who are using heroin and other opiate-based drugs who are under the age of 18, but only 5 are captured in this particular research. Over 2,500 of them were aged between 18 and 34. And over 2,500 of them used opiates with other drugs, so they were multi-drugs. 640 people used it between 2 and 6 days per week. 294 people used it once a week, and an astonishing in excess of 2,000 people in this state were using heroin every single day. Now, if that's not highlighting the need for providing an injecting centre, even if it's only one on a pilot basis, then I don't know what is. Now, let's take a look at the number of people who have lost their lives as a result of drug use. Again, the figures are slightly behind where we are. Between 2004 and 2014, there were over 6,600 people lost their lives through drug use. Nearly 4,000 of them was due to overdose. Over 40% of them were for non-poisoning, which is non-overdose purposes. A quarter of all deaths of overdose was as a result of heroin or involved heroin. Of those who lost their lives, 87% of them were male. 81% of them involved more than one drug, so it was heroin plus another. And of the number of people who lost their lives from using heroin, 48% of them were injecting the drug at the time of the death. Now, I wanted to stress that figure, Minister, because that then indicates that obviously more than half of the drug-related deaths due to heroin were actually down to non-injecting purposes, people smoking it, basically. And while this legislation is very, very welcome and is going to address the issue of intravenous use It doesn't address the 52% of people who lost their lives from smoking heroin, and I think we need to be very cognizant of that. What we are providing here is going to help a number of people. There is no doubt about that, and I welcome that. But it is not going to address the issue of drug use in this state. And I think what we need to be looking at, and unfortunately we are behind the times when it comes to other European states. I mean, you look at the evidence out there, and I saw one local councillor on debating yourself, Minister, and I won't name him, on a TV show recently, and he said there was no evidence to suggest that injecting centres saves lives. Well, I want to read into the record the number of people who have actually had their life saved because of these injecting centres. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction have calculated that in Germany, 10 people are saved every year because of these centres. In Canada, they say up to 12 deaths have been prevented every single year. And a 2011 study actually went into more detail. It tracked the number of fatal overdoses in the 32 months before a centre was opened and the 27 months after the centre was opened. And what it found was that the rate of overdose deaths fell by 35% in the first 2 years of the centre's operation, and while it only fell by less than 10% in other areas of the city where they weren't providing a supervised injecting centre. Not only does it prevent deaths, that same report also went on to say that it probably prevented 35 HIV infections every year since opening. Australia, well, there's a lot of research. It doesn't really go into the number of people who have been potentially saved. But what it does do, if you analyse all of the data, you can work it out. And they reckon that 25 overdose deaths are being prevented every single year by providing these centres. So the evidence is there. And I would agree with Deputy Chambers that when we're dealing with this type of issue, that the scaremongering has to go out the window and we have to rely on the evidence. Now I know, and I know this personally, Minister, and you know why I know this personally, there is a lot of stigma around people who use heroin. And we can pass this legislation, but for me that is only half the battle. We have to open one of these facilities. And let's be very clear about that. That is not going to be an easy job, because there will be a lot of people who have a lot of issues. NIMBYism will be up here. They won't want it in their backyard. And what I would say to those people is, you need to take your head out of the sand. I've seen it in my own city in Cork, where for years I was raising the issue of heroin use, and people were saying, shh, let's not mention that. It's bad for tourism. It's bad for publicity. But the reality is people were dying on our streets. And no matter how few media articles you read about it or how quiet you keep it, the reality is people were still dying, and you can either bury your head in the sand or you can do something about it. I would love to see one of these centres in my own community and my own constituency, because I know I've lost friends who have died from heroin overdoses. I have almost lost family members from heroin overdoses. And there are many people that I grew up with and went to school with, unfortunately, who are not here today because they became addicted to heroin and they have lost their lives. And I could probably name 6 close friends of mine who have unfortunately lost their lives because of overdoses, and nearly all of them were down to heroin. So I would love to have one of these in my own city. So I'm actually quite jealous that we're actually looking at a pilot project in Dublin. And I can understand why we're looking at a pilot project in Dublin when you consider nearly half of the heroin use and half the number of people who inject heroin actually reside in Dublin. But there are over 2,000 people outside of Dublin who are also injecting heroin, whose lives are just as important, Minister. But as I said, I know there will be a battle on people's hands to try and get this opened. But I would implore communities that when they are looking at this issue, this is not stigmatising your community. This is actually trying to save people's lives who reside within your community. Your neighbours, can be family members, they could be people you have grown up with. And I would encourage people to come at the debate with a very open mind. Now, Minister, I said that we are probably behind other international models. And the reason I say that is because what we are looking at is what other countries were looking at 10, 15 years ago, which is an injecting centre. Many European countries are now moving beyond the injecting centre model to a drug consumption model. And I think that's eventually where we need to go. And I gave you the figures. Considering 52% of all heroin-related deaths are actually from non-injecting, then I think the evidence is there to say that we should be moving to that. And I think it's also important to put on the record that we're not just talking about heroin. People who will be able to access these facilities could be injecting cocaine, they could be injecting amphetamines. It's not just heroin. No, heroin is predominantly the drug which will be used. Just on the legislation itself, Minister, I have a couple of observations. As you know, we did the pre-leg scrutiny within the committee, and the Research Library actually did a fine piece of work in relation to that. And it goes on page 39 of that particular publication. It looks at the main issues which were raised during the pre-leg scrutiny stage and how well the actual bill matches up with the concerns. And they identify three main areas where there was the majority of observations made. Unfortunately, two of the three haven't been addressed in the bill, Minister, and that is disappointing. The one area which has been addressed is the area of an authorised user, because that was an issue of concern at the committee. What is an authorised user? And I think you have addressed that in the legislation. And I would agree completely with the definition, Minister. I do have some concerns, and I just want to get the correct section. In relation to the authorised user, in the legislation it talks about people being excluded. It's section 7. It says, a licence holder or the person in charge of a supervised injecting centre for the time being may authorise a person not being a person prescribed as being ineligible to be an authorised user. And I was wondering if you could explain how do you become ineligible? And I don't know whether that's just the legal terms, but I presume the only way you can become ineligible is if you're not injecting, and if you're looking to smoke or you're looking to consume drugs in other ways rather than injecting. In the legislation, in section 5, and it's section 5, subsection 5, it talks about, there's a thing here that says the reasons why a licence can be withdrawn. And one of them says, where the Minister considers that there is a serious and immediate risk to the life, health or welfare of an authorised user, or to the well-being of staff of that facility. Now, Minister, I'm not happy with that wording. By its very nature, authorised users who are injecting heroin are in serious risk of their life. That's just the reality of drug use. And I don't want any caveat being put into legislation which would allow any future minister to revoke a licence on the basis that there is a risk to an authorised user's life or health. I mean, let's get real. He or she is in a centre injecting themselves with heroin. Of course there's going to be a risk to their life. Minister, I also, and this is one of the areas I raised in the committee, Section 11. I have concerns around Section 11, and that is giving members of An Garda Síochána permission to enter these centres. Now, I have concerns for a number of reasons. One, In order for this pilot project to be successful, we have to get the buy-in not only of local communities, not only of the Gardaí or of the Health Service Executive, we have to get the buy-in of the drug users themselves. Because if we don't get them to buy into this pilot project, then it is going to fail. And there will be devastating consequences, obviously, for those individuals if that is the case. Now, the reality is, I don't know how many drug users who are going to go and inject themselves with heroin will actually do so if there's a member of An Garda Síochána standing next to them inside the facility. I don't know how practical that is. I can understand the reasons why, Minister, you want to put it in there. Obviously, to prevent people from using the centre for profit, from selling, from dealing, from preying on vulnerable people who are drug users. But we need to look at this. I know at the committee stage, the pre-led stage, we muted the idea that we could have a code of practice with An Garda Síochána. Look, that's not going to happen. The law is the law is the law. The guards don't work off code of practices. They work off what's legal and what's not legal. And it will be illegal for me if I'm a heroin user and the injecting facility is beyond that door there and I'm 10 yards from it, I am committing an offence if I'm in possession of heroin. Now, and if a guard stops me, we're relying on the goodwill of the guard to say, it's all right, off you go, I know where you're off to. Now, many guards will do that. I'm not saying they won't, but it will still be illegal, Minister. And I think we need to address that whole area of decriminalisation. And we're not going to do it in this legislation, but we have to do it in the context of the National Drug Strategy. We have to look, I mean, if we're serious about moving to a public health model, then we need to be looking at decriminalisation. And that is going to be a very difficult conversation that we're going to have, but we need to have it. Now, what we are saying is that if somebody is caught in possession of a controlled substance within the facility, we're going to disapply the law to them. So, to put everyone's mind at ease, as a number of people have said to me that by passing this legislation, we're actually legalising heroin within certain facilities. That is not the case. My understanding is that even within a supervised injecting centre, if you are in possession of a controlled substance, you are still breaking the law. But what we are saying is that the guards, we're going to disapply that to individuals who are in there for the purposes of using that controlled substance. And I think we need to knock that myth on its head straight away. There's nobody in this House, whether we agree or disagree with the argument of legalisation or decriminalisation, proposing to legalise any controlled substance which is currently illegal. The second myth we need to knock on the head is in relation to drug crime. There is absolutely no evidence of all the research that has been done that suggests the establishment of an injecting centre increases drug crime in the locality. On the contrary, all of the evidence suggests it actually decreases drug crime. So, Minister, I hope we can progress the legislation very quickly. And I think once the legislation is progressed and is passed, there is a job of work for you, Minister, in relation to the regulations around providing a licence. It cannot be too restrictive, Minister. We cannot allow the regulations around providing a licence to become a stick which people who are opposed to this legislation to beat us with. We need to provide this centre because it is the right thing to do. There is no such thing as a good decision or a bad decision when it comes to providing an injecting centre. There is only the right decision and the wrong decision. And it is the right decision to provide these types of facilities. But these types of facilities are not just about allowing somebody to walk in off the street and inject themselves with an illegal substance and walk back out. That is not the purpose of them. The purpose of them is to save lives, and then that's the primary purpose. The secondary purpose is to try and address the drug issue and the drug problem that individual has. And we will do that by providing all of the ancillary services within that facility.
Thank you, Deputy.
And I can tell you, Minister, from my own experience, that if you have the right, and I'll finish on this, Cathaoirleach, if you have the right facility and you have the right services in place, you will not only save lives, but you will save people from a lifetime of drug addiction. Because if the facility is there that can actually provide the services when somebody is at their lowest point, they will grab it with both hands and they will take it. And they will do everything in their power to beat their drug addiction and become, functioning people in society again. And I wish you well with the legislation, Minister.
Tom Cotcher.